Hi everyone. This is old news more or less, but as you all probably know, Whoopi Goldberg found herself in some hot water over comments she made about the Holocaust. She said that the Holocaust was not about race, and that it was rather about, quote, white people doing it to other white people, end quote. Basically, her argument was that Jewish people are not a race, and she also implied by extension that European Jews are essentially white people. As a result of this, Whoopi Goldberg has been accused by some of being an anti-Semite, and some have went even far as calling her a Holocaust denier. And what I find most ironic about this whole situation is that the very people who are outraged at Whoopi Goldberg's comments are the same people who argue that race is purely a social construct and all of that stuff. In response to Whoopi Goldberg, Ben Shapiro put up a quotation from Mein Kampf on his Twitter account, in which Hitler stated in regards to Jewish people, quote, "Is not their very existence founded on one great lie, namely that they are a religious community, whereas in reality they are a race," end quote. However, it's not clear whether this particular quotation out of Mein Kampf refers to race in a biological sense, or rather race in a more sociological or metaphysical sense. For example, prior to the Second World War, many people around the world, including here in the US, frequently spoke about a so-called British race, German race, French race, Italian race, etc. And this was part of the normal speech and vernacular back in those days. Hitler's perception on Jewish identity was a lot more complex and ambiguous in the sense that he did not believe the Jews to be a race in the genetic or biological sense. In fact, in one of his testaments, he tells his associate and second-in-command Martin Bormann, quote, "We use the term Jewish race as a matter of convenience, for in reality and from the genetic point of view, there's no such thing as the Jewish race. There does, however, exist a community. It is a spiritually homogeneous group to which all Jews throughout the world deliberately adhere, and it is this group of human beings to which we give the title Jewish race," end quote. And Hitler continues by saying, quote, "The Jews are an abstract race of the mind that has its origins admittedly in the Hebrew religion. A race of the mind is something more solid, more durable than just a biological race, pure and simple," end quote. The thinkers and conquerors that shaped early Zionist thought were Jews who were primarily of European extraction, and while many of them proudly identified as Europeans, a few of them like Moses Hess and Israel Zangwill have promoted the concept of a distinct Jewish race. Both Hess and Zangwill developed theories in regards to Jewish physiognomy, the notion that Jewish people share particular physical traits. Moses Hess, for example, once made the claim that, quote, "The Germans hate less the Jews' religion than they hate their race. They object less to the Jews' particular religion than to their particular noses. You cannot reform the Jewish nose, nor can you turn through baptism the dark, curly Jewish hair into blonde, nor will any comb ever straighten it," end quote. Just to add a bit of a side note here, Moses Hess's hyperbolic description of Jews perfectly describes Gentiles like Zachary Levi, who, despite his Jewish-sounding name and his physical appearance, happens to be a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant of Welsh origins. And also Catherine Hahn, who's a Gentile of German, English, and Irish descent, who has also been mistaken for being Jewish. Whereas his description of the Gentile perfectly describes Jewish celebrities like Corey Haim, who has blonde hair, deep blue eyes, and a straight nose. And also the Jewish actor Steve Anton, whose phenotype matches that of a German or an Englishman. The convergence of phenotypes between Indo-Europeans and Ashkenazim is precisely what made it very easy for a Jewish actor like Peter Falk to portray the Italian-American Detective Columbo. And it's also how the Jewish actor Fisher Stevens was able to pull off an outstanding performance in his portrayal of the Indian engineer Ben Javeri in the classic 80s short circuit films. Throughout my childhood, I truly believed that the actor who played Ben Javeri was from India, and was surprised to discover that he was in fact Jewish. And if you look very closely, Fisher Stevens strongly resembles the Indian actor Saif Ali Khan. And I'll get back to that and the question of physiognomy later. But moving on from that and back onto Israel Zangwill. Zangwill's racial theories were also on par with that of Moses Hess. Not only did he project his own physical appearance onto all European Jews, but he also fostered racial theories which Theodore Herzl brilliantly refuted. Herzl, who is credited as being one of the fathers of modern political Zionism, had stated in a diary entry dated November 21st, 1896, in London, England, quote, "Israel Zangwill is of the long-nosed Negro type, with woolly deep black hair. However, he maintains the racial point of view, something I cannot accept, for I merely have to look at him, and then look at myself. All I am saying is, we are an historical unit, one nation with anthropological diversities. This also suffices for the Jewish state. No nation has uniformity of race." End quote. Apart from Herzl's rejection of Jewish racialism, he embraced and maintained strong pride in his European identity. He was a passionate Germanophile who saw the Germans as representing the best Kulturvolk, which is German for cultured people. And this was a sentiment which he largely inherited from his mother Jeanette, who herself was enamored by the German classics and German identity. Theodore Herzl desired German and English to be the official languages of the Jewish state, rather than Hebrew. The provocative and very outspoken Israeli writer Amos Elan had actually revealed in his book entitled The Israelis, Founders and Sons that Herzl was, quote, largely ignorant of Jewish traditions. He was not interested in the romantic revival of Hebrew, nor in the recreation of the historical Hebrew peasant. This would have been to Herzl like arming a modern army with a crossbow and arrow, end quote. Amos Elan had pointed out in his biography of Herzl that Herzl also met with the Grand Duke of Baden, who served as an intermediary between him and the Kaiser, and Herzl explained to him that he envisioned the Jewish state as being a German outpost and protectorate that would export German culture to the Orient. Amos also mentions the fact that Herzl's hero ideal had always been the Prussian nobleman, even long after his conversion to the Zionist mission. What's perhaps most intriguing about Herzl was his development vis-a-vis Zionism. Prior to his conversion to Zionism, Herzl remarked, quote, "And if the Jews really return home one day, they would discover on the next that they do not belong together. For centuries they have been rooted in diverse nationalisms. They differ from each other group by group. The only thing they have in common is the pressure that holds them together." End quote. Michael Seltzer, an American Jew who authored very controversial books such as The Outcast of Israel, Communal Tensions in the Jewish State, and also The Aryanization of the Jewish State, had commented, quote, "Herzl's remarkable prediction is strikingly fulfilled in the bewildered observation, heard so frequently in Israel that it is something of a cliché. When I was in Hungary or elsewhere, I always regarded myself as a Jew. Now that I am in Israel, I feel like a Hungarian, or a Pole, or German, or Yemenite, or Egyptian, etc. In Israel, Jewishness recedes into the background as a factor for social cohesion and becomes instead merely a secondary identification." End quote. Vladimir Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who developed an interpretation of Zionism that would come to be known as revisionist Zionism, had also expressed a somewhat ambivalent view regarding Jewish identity. According to Raphael Falk, a German Jewish geneticist and historian of science, Jabotinsky was highly influenced by some of the race theories which were prevalent in Europe and around the world at the time. Jabotinsky himself was an admirer of the Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini, and even modeled his paramilitary organization after Mussolini's black shirts. It's also been documented that Jabotinsky's revisionist camp had received military training under the authority of the Italian fascist regime. On the one hand, Jabotinsky alluded to the idea of a so-called Jewish race, but as Raphael Falk points out, it isn't clear whether he's referring to a Jewish race in the genetic sense or rather in a more cultural and environmental sense. In various writings, Jabotinsky proudly identified as a European, and went as far as describing Zionism as an expression of European culture. In one of his articles penned in 1927 entitled The Arabesque Fashion, Jabotinsky asserts his view that the Ashkenazi and Western Sephardim are a European people deeply ingrained in European culture, and that in the Occident, as opposed to the Middle Eastern Levant, lies the future of the Jews. He states, quote, "We the Jews have no connection with that Orient, perhaps even less than other European people. It cannot be argued that we belong to the Orient because we came originally from Asia. All Central Europe is full of races who also came from Asia, and at a much later period than we. All the Ashkenazi Jews, and certainly half of the Sephardi ones, have been resident in Europe for 2,000 years. The spiritual atmosphere of Europe is ours. We have the same rights in it just like the Germans, and the English, and the Italian, and the French. And in Palestine, this creativity will continue. As Max Nordau has put it so well, we come to the land of Israel in order to push the moral frontiers of Europe up to the Euphrates." End quote. Perhaps even more radical and Eurocentric than Jabotinsky was one of his predecessors by the name of Arthur Ruppin. Arthur Ruppin was a German Jewish sociologist who's widely recognized as being the founding father of Zionist settlement. He was hired by the World Zionist Organization to investigate areas for possible Jewish settlement and ultimately acquire land. He oversaw land procurement on behalf of the Palestine Land Development Corporation and the Jewish Colonization Association, which sought to create colonies in places like Argentina, Germany, Poland, the Crimea, Russia, North America, and East Africa. What made Ruppin very controversial was his views on racial theories. It's even been reported that Ruppin had met with Hans Friedrich Karl Gunther, a German physician, writer, and member of the Nazi Party, who was well known and notorious for some of his own racial theories, and for also being a mentor to Heinrich Himmler. But perhaps even more controversial than Ruppin's race theories were his views regarding Jewish identity. According to Ruppin, the original Jews were actually non-Semitic Indo-Germanic tribes. Over time, some of the original Jews began to intermix with these Semitic tribes, thereby compromising their original racial composition. For Ruppin, the Semitic element represented a dysgenic and corrupting force, and it was for this reason that he regarded the Sephardic Mizrahi Jews of the Middle East and North Africa as being racially inferior and biologically deficient, whereas the Ashkenazim represented the original Indo-Germanic Jews who maintained a higher degree of racial purity. The Sephardic Mizrahi Jews, in Ruppin's view, were no different than the Arabs, the Berbers, and Muslims of the Middle East and North Africa, as far as their racial makeup was concerned. He also goes as far as suggesting that the Oriental Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews were descended from Arabs, Berbers, and Muslim proselytes who converted to Judaism. And he even provides an example of the King Yusuf du Nawaz, a Yemenite warlord who established a Jewish state in the Arabian Peninsula in the 6th century, and forced by the sword the entire population to adopt Judaism as their religion. Those who refused were massacred by him. Ruppin also examines the extent to which ancient conversions to Judaism had affected the composition of various Jewish groups like the Jews of the Caucasus and the Bukharian Jews of Uzbekistan. When it came to Jewish settlement, Ruppin believed that the Semitic element amongst the Mizrahi Jews was a degenerative factor that could potentially endanger Ashkenazis. Rather than integrating the Mizrahi Jews, Ruppin conceived of an economic operation within the framework of his eugenics plan. Instead of integrating the Mizrahi Jews, they would be used for cheap labor, and he states, quote, "In small numbers, they might be extremely useful because of their small needs and in particular their ability to compete in wages with the Arab agricultural laborers. The Oriental Jew who could do the rough work at the same price as the Arab." End quote. As for other types of Jews, like the black Jews of Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa, Ruppin not only doubted their Jewishness, but he supported a complete ban on them from entering his ideal Jewish state. In 1976, Arthur Koestler, a Hungarian Jewish author and journalist, published a highly contentious book entitled The 13th Tribe. Whereas Arthur Ruppin's works focused more on the conversions to Judaism that took place in Central Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, and Ethiopia, Koestler delved into the mass conversions which took place under the authority of the Khazars, a confederation of Eurasian Turks, Indo-European Slavs, and Asiatic Mongols who rose to become one of the most powerful commercial empires in Eurasia and Eastern Europe. Koestler posited that the racial composition of Ashkenazi Jews originates primarily from the polyethnic Khazar peoples rather than the Hebrews. Despite the fact that the history of the Khazars and their conversion to Judaism had been analyzed by scholars and academics long before Koestler, it never received the level of attention it did until after his book was published. While it's absolutely true that many anti-Zionists have used Koestler's material to try and delegitimize Israel, many of the proponents of the Khazar narrative were nonetheless committed Zionists and supporters of Israel. Koestler was amongst the first Zionist settlers to settle Palestine. Not only was he a member of the revisionist Zionist underground, he also ran the secretariat of Ze'ev Jabotinsky's revisionist party and remained a close companion and devotee to Jabotinsky unto his death. His initial interpretation of Zionism, in particular the revisionist flavor, would eventually evolve into a more complex and personal form of Zionism. As far as Koestler was concerned, Israel's right to exist was not based on hypothetical origins of Jewish people. It was rather based on international law and the pioneering efforts of the early Zionist immigrants. And while it's also true that many anti-Zionists have used Koestler's book to try and negate and perhaps insult the Ashkenazi identity, many distinguished Ashkenazi scholars have expressed deep pride and admiration for the Khazars and their revolutionary history. Whereas the ancient Hebrews represented subservience, humiliation, and defeat, the Khazars symbolized strength, victory, and salvation for the Jews. Raymond Scheindlin, professor emeritus of medieval Hebrew literature at the Jewish Theological Seminary, once stated, quote, "To the oppressed Jews of the world, the Khazars were a source of pride and hope, for their existence seemed to prove that God had not completely abandoned his people." End quote. Benzion Netanyahu, an Israeli historian and father of Benjamin Netanyahu, had referenced the Khazars in relation to Israel Zangwill's desire for the creation of a Jewish homeland. He stated, quote, certain that a free Jewish state would enhance the standing of Jews in the world. He also believed it would buoy the spirits of Jewry as a whole. Did not even the Khazar state raise the spirits of Hizdai ibn Shaprut? And when did that occur? At the height of Spanish Jewry's golden age. In any place where a great Jewish center would be founded, a beacon for all humanity would be established." End quote. Lastly, there's Peter Benjamin Golden, Professor Emeritus of History and Specialist in Turkish and Middle Eastern Studies, who stated, quote, "What few school children are aware of is that if not for the Khazars, Eastern Europe might well have become a province of Islam. The Khazars blunted the Arab advance through the Caucasus and fought them there to a standstill." End quote. Within the first chapter of the 13th Tribe, underneath the section on the rise of the Khazars, Koestler provides accounts relating to the physical attributes of the Khazars as recorded by Persian and Arab Muslim geographers, chroniclers, and historians. According to the records of these scholars, ethnic and racial diversity permeated the kingdom of Khazaria. You had the Black Khazars, who were black-haired, brown-skinned, and resembled the peoples of India. You had the White Khazars, who were light-complexioned with piercing blue eyes and blonde or reddish hair. And then you had the Red Khazars, who were Asiatic Mongols with long narrow eyes and a slightly red complexion. In the subsequent section regarding the conversions that took place under the Khazars, Koestler references historical accounts regarding the mass immigration of Jews from Islamic countries and Byzantium who settled in the kingdom of Khazaria. Many of these Jewish immigrants from the Middle East, North Africa, and the Mediterranean were escaping the subjugation and religious persecution faced in Christian and Muslim lands. The Jewish historians Nathan Ozabel and Simon Shama, in their textbooks on the history of the Jews, have also highlighted how the Khazar rulers like Bulan and Ovadia have imported into their kingdom rabbis and Talmudic scholars from the Middle East, most notably from present-day Iraq and Iran, as part of their program of Judaization. Through the absorption of these Jewish immigrants from the Middle East and Mediterranean, Koestler suggests that an infusion of Semitic blood would then enter the Khazar gene pool. One of the most critical pieces of Koestler's 13th Tribe was the 8th chapter of his book entitled Race and Myth, which completely shattered the notion of a particular Jewish physiognomy and stereotypes such as the so-called Jewish nose, which people like Moses Hess have propagated. He analyzes and quotes from extensive studies undertaken by biological anthropologists like Maurice Fishberg and Juan Comas. Maurice Fishberg was a Jewish-American anthropologist who specialized in the ethnology of the Jews. And he found that of 2,836 Jews he examined from New York City, only 14% had a hooked nose, while 57% were straight-nosed, 20% snub-nosed, and 6.5% flat and broad noses. Other anthropologists discovered more or less the same thing among Jews in Poland and the Ukraine. Koestler continues to reference Fishberg, who states that the hooked nose appears frequently among the Caucasian tribes and the people of Asia Minor, whereas amongst the pure Semitic groups, and he gives the example of the Bedouins, hooked noses were rare and less frequent in comparison. Groups such as the Armenians and Georgians possess physical qualities that are commonly attributed to Jewish people. And Koestler draws from Fishberg, who correctly points out that the aquiline nose is far more common among Gentiles of the Mediterranean, like the Greeks, Italians, French, Spanish, Portuguese, than it is among the Jews of Eastern Europe. As for the works of Juan Comas, a Spanish physical anthropologist who's best known for his analytical works on race, he found that contrary to the stereotype of European Jews being dark-haired and dark-eyed, 49% of Polish Jews were light-haired, and 54% of Jewish schoolchildren in Austria had blue eyes. Similar percentages prevailed among Jews elsewhere in Europe. In Koestler's effort to further dispel the myth of a Jewish race and Jewish particularism, he, like Arthur Ruppin, makes reference to other Jewish communities he believed were also converted to Judaism. He mentions the black-skinned Falasha of Abyssinia, who look no different from the Ethiopian Gentiles, the Chinese Jews of Kaifeng, who clearly look Chinese, the Yemenite Jews, who are identical to the Arabs of the Arabian Peninsula, and the Jewish Berber tribes of North Africa, who closely resemble the Tuareg. To Koestler, this was testament to Judaism's fervent proselytization and conversion of the Gentile, something which characterized Judaism during its early phases. To use the Book of Esther's mode of expression, prior to the massacre of 75,000 Persian men, women, and children at the hands of the Israelites, Mordecai issued his ordinance in which, quote, "The Jews had joy and gladness, feasting and mirth, and many of the Gentiles were circumcised and became Jews for fear of the Jews." End quote. As far as Koestler was concerned, the racial and ethnic diversity among Jews completely demolished the myth of a Jewish race and the idea of a pure line of descent going back to the Hebrews. In pursuit of debunking the biblical myth of Israelite racial purity, Koestler points out the irony of the Hebrew Bible's prohibition on marrying Gentiles when some of the Hebrew prophets themselves married or cohabited with Gentiles. Some of the prophets of the Israelites even had Gentile or partial Gentile origins. He adds that while Judaism discouraged marriage with Gentiles, it permitted sexual relations with female captives of war, and vice versa, Jewish women were also made concubines by Gentiles during wartime. Koestler relates a narration attributed to Judah ben Ezekiel, a Babylonian rabbinical scholar who opposed his son marrying a woman who is not of the seed of Abraham. His friend Ulla then responded by posing the question, quote, "How do we know for certain that we ourselves are not descended from the heathens who violated the maidens of Zion at the siege of Jerusalem?" End quote. Apart from the racial and ethnic hybridization which characterized early Judaism, Koestler also argued that the imposed separations between Jews and Gentiles have resulted in the development of distinct traits by means of endogamy and consanguineous unions. These imposed practices have been instituted by what he describes as the Jewish faith's self-segregating nature and its so-called chosen race pride. These practices would then produce a degree of uniformity. That, combined with the anti-Jewish laws which existed in parts of the world, has led to ghettoization and the transformation of the Jews into what he would then call a pseudo-nation. Within the early stages of the Israeli state, many members of Israel's intelligentsia apparatus had railed against the immigration of Mizrahi Jews to Israel. Amos Ilan, who I mentioned earlier vis-a-vis his masterly biography of Herzl, was sent by Haaretz to Morocco in 1953 to visit prospective Moroccan Jewish immigrants. To his shock, he described the Jewish quarters of Morocco as being degenerate, diseased, stench-filled, and perverse. He also stated that the Jewish neighborhoods he visited looked far worse than the Muslim neighborhoods. Ilan was said to have expressed concerns about the Moroccan Jews' uncontrolled fertility and how this may have a negative impact on Israeli genetics. Aryeh Gelblum, a Polish Jew who also served as a correspondent for Haaretz, wanted a total ban on North African Jews from entering the country. He stated, quote, "This is the immigration of a race, such as we have never known in this country. We are dealing with a people whose primitiveness is a record. Their degree of education borders on total ignorance, and even worse is their total inability to absorb anything spiritual." End quote. And he also adds, quote, "In their living quarters, you'll find filth, card games for money, drunkenness, and prostitution. Above all these is a fundamental problem: the absence of any ability to assimilate into the life of the country, and first and foremost, a chronic laziness and hatred of labor." End quote. In terms of Israel's melting pot strategy, otherwise known in Hebrew as Mizug Galuyot, Israel has had a very difficult time absorbing various Jewish races and ethnicities during its early phases. David Ben-Gurion, who was the primary national founder of the State of Israel, had actually expressed concerns about the large influx of Mizrahi and Oriental Sephardic Jews into the Israeli state and the implications that this would have for the future. One of his worries was that the European-descended Jews would eventually be outnumbered by the more Arab-looking Middle Eastern Jews, and that the Israeli state would become more Levantine and less European in this process of demographic change. Ben-Gurion stated, and I quote, "In another 10 to 15 years, they, the Mizrahi Jews, will be the nation, and we will become a Levantine nation, unless with a deliberate effort we raise them to the level of the customs you follow, as you became used to them only among European Jewry, at a time when the Jewish nation was European. The problem is what the character of the Oriental communities will be. They will be the majority of the nation. They have 6 to 8 children, and the Ashkenazim only 2 children. The question is whether they will lower the nation, or whether we will succeed by artificial means and with great efforts to elevate them. In another 15 to 20 years, they will be the majority. They will not vote for people of European origin." End quote. Under Ben-Gurion's leadership, various controversies involving medical experimentation on the Mizrahi Jewish population had taken place. In the 1950s, during what would come to be known as the Yemenite Children Affair, Yemenite Jewish immigrants have had blood samples drawn from them in order to determine whether they had Negro blood, and this was due to the presence of sickle cell anemia within the Yemenite Jewish community, a blood disorder that primarily affects sub-Saharan Africans. The Israeli establishment at the time suspected that the Yemenite Jews might have had a significant sub-Saharan African admixture. It has been alleged by the members of the Mizrahi Jewish community that organs were harvested from the bodies of these new immigrants. Allegations of forced sterilization of the Yemenites by the Israeli government have also surfaced, as well as claims that many of the Yemenite babies and children had been kidnapped and put up for adoption many times abroad. Those put up for adoption in Israel were given to Ashkenazi families. This is a case which the Israeli state claims to be investigating till this day. Also within that period, you had the notorious ringworm affair, where an alleged number of 20,000 all the way up to 200,000 Mizrahi Jews from North Africa and the Middle East had been exposed to radiation in order to supposedly treat ringworm infections carried by these North African Jewish immigrants. The head of this operation was the Director General of the Israeli Health Ministry at that time, Dr. Chaim Shiba. Dr. Chaim Shiba had traveled to the United States and returned to Israel with 7 X-ray machines supplied to him by the US Army. Each of these Mizrahi children were administered 35,000 times the maximum dose of X-rays through their heads. It's been alleged that 6,000, possibly even more of those children had died, while the remaining developed cancers and other disorders like epilepsy, psychosis, amnesia, etc. And of that number, many suffered from sterility and fertility problems. In the state of Israel till this day, the tensions between the Ashkenazim and Mizrahim are referred to as the ethnic demon. And while the tensions are not as big as they used to be, say 20 to 30 years ago, largely due to intermarriages between the Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, and also due to the intermarriages with other Jewish ethnicities like the Jews of India and the Black Ethiopian Jews, inter-Jewish ethnic and racial tensions still exist in Israel in spite of that. In fact, there's a joke and cliche in Israel which states that the darker skinned you are, the more likely you are to be right-wing, religious, and fanatical. Generally speaking in Israel, Jews of white European origin are far more likely to vote liberal, left-wing, and socialist. Whereas dark-skinned Mizrahi Jews are more likely to vote right-wing, ultra-conservative, and halakhically religious. One notable area where this ethnic demon had unleashed his fury was the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin by the Jewish extremist Yigal Amir. While Yigal Amir claims his motive behind the killing was his opposition to the Oslo Peace Accords, there have been speculations that inter-Jewish ethnic strife had played a role in Amir's murder of Rabin. Yitzhak Rabin was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jewish man with origins in the Ukraine and Belarus, whereas his killer Yigal Amir was an Arab Jew whose parents immigrated from Yemen. Prior to the assassination, Yigal Amir had been dating a girl by the name of Nava Holzman, who was of Ashkenazi European background. Nava's parents objected to the relationship due to Yigal's Mizrahi background and darker skin tone. And eventually, Nava Holzman broke up with Yigal and married one of his college buddies. Yigal reportedly fell into a deep depression as a result of this, and Shlomo Amir, the father of Yigal, had stated to the Israeli press he believed that this was a pivotal moment for his son, and that had his son married Holzman, he would have never killed Rabin. In addition to that, the Yemenite children affair may have also served as a trigger for Yigal. His brother Haggai, who was also convicted for conspiring to murder Rabin and for planning to launch attacks against Palestinians, had shared a post on Facebook of a Yemenite Jewish man whose grandparents lost their children to the state of Israel. The post ended with the following statement, quote, "Damned state of Israel, you were born in blood and will die in oblivion," end quote. Also was the Israeli government's raiding of the home of Rabbi Uzi Meshulam, a Yemenite religious conservative rabbi who demanded that the Israeli government launch a complete investigation into the kidnappings and disappearance of the Yemenite children. When he and his followers barricaded themselves in his private residence in Yahud, the police surrounded his house for weeks and eventually broke into his home and shot one of his followers dead. Dan Efron, who wrote a book on Rabin's assassination, suggested that this event further inspired Yigal Amir and his brother to channel their anger and resentment towards Rabin. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, the former chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel, who has gained notoriety for some of the inflammatory and racist remarks he made against various groups of people, had in fact made some very controversial anti-Ashkenazi statements. For instance, he discouraged Sephardic Jews from attending Ashkenazi-ran institutions and schools, warning them that, quote, "You will have an Ashkenazi brain," end quote. Israel Shahak, an Israeli political scientist and civil rights activist who authored very sensitive titles such as Jewish Fundamentalism in Israel, had recorded the various brawls and fistfights that took place between the members of the Mizrahi Shas party, of which Rabbi Yosef was the head of, and Ashkenazi Jews. In retaliation for attacks upon a fellow Shas member, a number of Mizrahi Jews had beaten up Ashkenazi Jews who were supposedly involved in the attack, and went as far as desecrating their synagogues. In Israel, it's not uncommon to see or hear a Mizrahi Jew insult an Ashkenazi by telling him or her, quote, "It is a pity that Hitler did not finish all of you," end quote, or, quote, "It is a pity that Eichmann did not work overtime," end quote. In fact, in May of 2006, Amitai Amir, another brother of Rabin's assassin, had approached a Judea regional brigade commander, gave him the Nazi salute, and then shouted, "Heil Hitler." Anger was expressed by the Israeli public and politicians over the fact that he was not arrested and convicted for this. In October of 2007, the Israeli Haaretz newspaper published 2 articles in which a right-wing and religious Mizrahi Jew had called for the extermination of Ashkenazim. This Mizrahi Jew went by the assumed identity of Stephen Malik. Malik was a member of the Jewish National Front, a religious far-right party founded by Baruch Marzel, Michael Ben-Ari, and Itamar Ben-Gavir. Eventually, he was expelled from this organization due to his extreme and nutty views. According to Malik's autobiography, he was born in the United Kingdom to a Mizrahi Jewish family. He claims that his anti-Ashkenazi views had led to frequent arrests in Britain, but that he had been acquitted of all charges. After immigrating to Israel, he continued to disseminate his message through various online internet forums. The administrators of these forums reportedly turned over this hate material to the police, and the police then handed it over to Israel's internal security service, the Shin Bet. Due to the extremely inflammatory nature of Malik's remarks and his explicit call for extermination, I will not be narrating his quotations. Rather, I'll put them up for you to read for yourself. Back in 1964, Kalman Katznelson, who was a former member of the Brit HaBiryonim, a revisionist Zionist splinter group, had authored a very controversial book entitled The Ashkenazi Revolution. And one of the motivations behind the writing of this book was the anti-Ashkenazi racism and sentiment which apparently pervaded the Mizrahi Jewish community at the time. In his book, Katznelson detailed his transformation from being a Zionist to becoming an Ashkenazi nationalist. He proudly declared, quote, "I'm not a Zionist, but an Ashkenazi nationalist," end quote. Near the middle of his book, Katznelson laments and expresses regret at the World Zionist Congress's rejection of Theodore Herzl's Uganda plan, where Herzl sought to create a Jewish state in a portion of British East Africa. For Katznelson, this was a missed opportunity to create a great Ashkenazi civilization inside of East Africa. Katznelson described the Zionist rejection of Herzl's Uganda plan as being, quote, "a black day, not only in the history of the Jewish people, but also in the history of Europe and the entire world," end quote. Interestingly, and in a way reminiscent to some of Arthur Ruppin's race theories, Katznelson interprets the Hebrew Bible as being a book of intra-Jewish wars, in which Israelite tribes would conquer and dominate the inferior Israelite tribes, taking their place. He makes it clear that the Bible is not a book of integration, and that most of the biblical experts are hiding this truth from the public. Controversially, throughout his book, Katznelson presents the Mizrahim as an inferior race that endangers the well-being and existence of the Ashkenazi race. He denounces the Mizrahi racial insults directed towards Ashkenazim, the very same insults used by Sephardic Jews like Stephen Malik. Katznelson objects to mixed marriages between Ashkenazis and Mizrahis, and goes as far as calling for the creation of an Ashkenazi apartheid state in which Mizrahi Jews and other non-Ashkenazis would be stripped of their political rights. In his ideal state, Yiddish would be the official national language due to its high-quality German roots. All peoples within the state would be required to learn and speak Yiddish. For Katznelson, Hebrew was too much like the Arabic language and represented a leap backwards towards degeneration. While he believed that the Hebrew language and Hebrew revival movement had strengthened the Sephardic Mizrahi peoples, it only weakened the Ashkenazim and had taken them out of the fold of eternity, to use his expression. Mizrahi and Oriental Sephardic Jews would then be encouraged to leave and evacuate the Ashkenazi state. The end result of all this would be the ultimate preservation of the Ashkenazi peoples and the prevention of any sort of absorption into the Mizrahi majority. Unfortunately for Katznelson, this dream would never come true, and the Ashkenazis within Israel would eventually be outnumbered by the more populous Mizrahi Jewish population. Meron Benvenisti, an Israeli political scientist and ethnographer of Greek Jewish, Italian Jewish, and Lithuanian Jewish background, had some harsh criticisms of the Mizrahim and their grievances towards European Jews. He stated, quote, "And it's the same with the Mizrahim. I do not accept all this Mizrahi whining, because what would the Mizrahim have done if we had not been here to take them in? What would they be worth? If it had not been for us, the Mizrahim would have remained a potpourri of migrant cultures. We made a heroic decision to take them all in, and by that decision, we effectively committed suicide. Our Hebrew-Israeli culture dissolved under the flood of immigration. This is why we now have Likud governments and constantly hear Mizrahi whining. But I do not accept either the one or the other. I am proud of being a white Sabra, and I will not allow anyone to expel me from the Zionist camp. I am one of the founders of this place. I am from the Zionist Mayflower." End quote. Going back to Whoopi Goldberg and the comments that she made, some of her critics like Rudy Rachman have actually stated that Whoopi was wrong because, quote, "the people who are anti-Semites know how to recognize us when we look a certain way," end quote. And he's presumably speaking about the stereotypes and so-called Jewish physiognomy, which had been thoroughly debunked by Arthur Koestler and the biological anthropologists which he extensively cited. In order to prove how ridiculous and utterly stupid this is, I'm going to show a series of photographs comparing Jews and Gentiles, thereby demonstrating that there's no such thing as a particular Jewish physiognomy. The photograph on the left will be that of a Jewish individual, and the photograph on the right side will be that of a non-Jewish or Gentile individual. Had I not told you that these were two different people, you'd easily swear that these were either the same people or at the very least siblings or close relatives. Now, consider the fact that there have been a number of Gentile personalities who have been mistaken for being Jewish on the basis of their supposed facial characteristics. For example, Charlie Chaplin, Simon Bird, Jason Biggs, Martin Starr, Paul Rust, Joy Behar, Sarah Bareilles, and Rupert Murdoch. And on the other side of the spectrum, you've had a number of celebrities of European Jewish background who have been mistaken for being Gentiles and non-Jewish. For example, the celebrities Vic Morrow, Kirk Douglas, William Shatner, Michelle Trachtenberg, Bar Raffaelli, Randy Gerber, Paul Rudd, and Robert Greene. All of these personalities, with the exception of Paul Rudd, are distinguished by their blonde hair. And all of them, including Paul Rudd, have piercing light eyes and Northern European features. This all goes back to the very wise saying that you can't always judge by appearances alone. With all of that being said, I personally think that many people have blown Whoopi Goldberg's statements out of proportion. The Jews are not a race, and as demonstrated by some of the Zionist pioneers like Herzl and Jabotinsky, there's clearly a difference of opinion over the nature of Jewish identity. And we should learn to celebrate these differences rather than create conflicts over them. Well, that's it for now, folks. If you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, and share with your friends and family. Comment down below if you have any thoughts or ideas you'd like to share, and please be respectful with each other. Thank you and have a great day.